So I'm going to tell you about, I'll say, my own personal journey in technology, entrepreneurship in Silicon Valley. And it started a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. So we've already had a Star Trek reference. So Star Wars deserves equal time. And by the way, for those of you who've never seen it, this is called a necktie, a necktie. When I first arrived in Santa Clara as a 17-year-old freshman at Santa Clara University, Silicon Valley was actually known as the Prune Capital of America. If you ever drive around, say, you see Prune Yard, Prune Ridge, it was an agricultural valley. And I got involved in technology in the very earliest of days. I wrote the owner's manual for Pong, the first home video game in '75. Thank you. And as a friend of mine says, the gray hair is authentic. I don't go to the salon and have it added artificially. That was one of the, let's see if I can use the, that was a personal computer. Yes, you programmed it with little toggle switches on the front panel. These were cell phones. They looked like walkie-talkies in the early '80s. This was Windows, the early version of Windows. And the first internet browser, Mosaic. Hard to imagine. This is actually 20 years ago. We started the internet. Now, obviously, Silicon Valley. And we have a TV show named after us, right? It's like we're not just a huge business on our own with technology and semiconductors and the internet, but we're changing the way education, government, business works. And so, we're pretty damn proud of ourselves. We're a big deal. And now we've become statesmen. Bill and Melinda Gates are trying to cure disease across Africa. Mark Benioff is funding children's hospitals. Larry Ellison went out and won the America's Cup. And so there's always things like, winners write the history. So as we now become statesmen, we start to write the history, right? It's like so you clean up the messy bits. You start saying, oh, yeah, we always knew how this was going to end. And for those of you that are coming into the business now, it always seems like, well, yeah, this is a real business. This is legit. This is a good deal. And, it's a business for MBAs and 5-year plans. But I want to, be your crazy uncle for a few minutes. Because, like Thanksgiving dinner, right? Your mom starts telling the family history, and all the kids behaved well, right? The summers were warmer, the grass was greener, the snow was whiter, everybody got along. Then all of a sudden your crazy uncle goes, wait, that's not what really happened, right? It's like, you remember that uncle that got hung for being a cattle rustler? I remember when so-and-so, got into a fight at Christmas dinner and they started throwing food. Well, what I want to do is I want to go back to the really early days of Silicon Valley and kind of talk about what it was like at the beginning, kind of what you can learn from those early days. So now, we've got, like I said, we've got foundations. The new Steve Jobs book makes him sound like Saint Steve. But I want to go back to the early days. This was, Steve, in the early days of Apple, Larry Ellison, and Bill Gates. And so if you called central casting and says, okay, we want to find young men who are going to revolutionize business, create multi-billion-dollar companies, become the richest men in the world, probably didn't look like this. And now you go, now you say, okay, well, we're going to, raise venture capital, we're going to go public, we're going to. 40 years ago, 35 years ago, that's not how it looked. In fact, the only reason any of us could do anything like start a revolution is because nobody took us seriously. It's like I did focus groups for the first personal computer, the Commodore PET, Personal Electronic Translator, in 1977. And we got a room full of people together and said, would you like a personal computer? Absolutely not. What would I do with a personal computer? We asked people, well, would you like, 6, 7 years later in the early 80s, would you like a cell phone? No. Can't imagine what I'd do with a cell phone. Why would I want one of those? How many people have ever heard the story of how Microsoft's big break involving the IBM personal computer? Yeah, a couple. The dominant operating system in the late 70s, early 80s was CPM, done by a company called Digital Research, Gary Kildall. And IBM was going to build its first personal computer. The ones like we'd seen before with the little toggle switches on the front, they were built mostly in people's garages. But IBM was going to come in, it was going to legitimize the business. They wanted an operating system. And so they went out to Monterey, California, Pacific Grove technically, to see Gary Kildall. And Gary Kildall says, oh, IBM isn't ever going to really build a personal computer. It's kind of boring. I'd rather fly. It's a beautiful day like this outside. I don't have to talk to him. And the IBM executives, being proud IBM big blue guys, they basically said, well, we can't be treated like this. And they went off in search of another operating system. Bill Gates didn't actually have an operating system, but he knew where he could borrow one. And so he borrowed an operating system from, I think it was Falcon Systems at the time, and that became DOS, which became one of the foundations of the empire. But let me go forward from that point, 10 years, to when I used to run the Microsoft ad account worldwide. And at the time, we had just launched Windows. We were rolling out the Windows apps, and nobody took us seriously. So 1991, people thought, well, Microsoft is really an operating system company because of IBM. Anybody know what their #1 application was at the time? Not a spreadsheet. No, based language. #1 app was Flight Simulator. And when we ran, I created a first multi-page ad in Microsoft history, and we're going to put Windows on the first spread, and we really, really wanted to show Word and Excel on the next 2 spreads. The Word and Excel product managers wouldn't let us do that, because they said, nobody cares about our applications. You got to show 1, 2, 3 and Word perfect. But we would sit there, and we'd sit there in a meeting, we'd say, all right, our vision is a computer on every desk and in every home running Microsoft software. And we damn near had a hard time not laughing. Because it was ridiculous, right? It's like nobody cared about Windows, nobody cared about Word, nobody cared about Excel, and certainly nobody in an enterprise would ever run Microsoft software. As the head of their consulting group once said, you're not even the biggest software company in Redmond, Washington. Nintendo is. But what we had was, A, the audacity to dream big dreams, and then second, the discipline to chop those big dreams up into bite-sized bits and execute. You know the old joke, how do you eat an elephant? 1 bite at a time. But in terms of my 40 years of watching people build big companies, those are the 2 things you can never get away from. Now they call it venture scale, but you have to have the willingness to dream big, stupid, audacious dreams that you have absolutely no right to dream. You have to have, and when people laugh at you, look at you funny, and say, oh, nobody will ever want that, right? Nobody will ever go on Facebook. 140 characters, that's stupid. You can say, that's fine, thanks. And then sit there and go, okay, here's how I'm going to execute. It's like I'm going to 1 step at a time, 1 bite at a time. The last group talked about China. I worked for one of the great entrepreneurs, a guy named Pat McGovern, who founded International Data Group. Started in 1964 selling a magazine or newspaper about computers out of the back of his station wagon. Again, not obvious in 1964 that anybody wanted a newspaper about computers. In 1979, they announced the open door policy in China. In 1980, 34 years ago, Pat picked up and opened operations in China. In 1997, I was over in Shanghai running a finishing school for Chinese publishers. Back to the notion, they got to be partners, not just labor. But it was that willingness, and again, even in 1997, people said, what are you doing in Shanghai? There's no market in China. But, and even, remember, 8 years before that was Tiananmen Square. And everybody's like, oh my God, you got to run out of China. It's like, there's no future in China. But it was that same thing of discipline, execution, consistency. Pat stuck it out. And, as you think about business and starting a business, It's just too easy to get discouraged by everybody. So the reality is and remains, it's angry, ambitious, and talented people who actually change the world, especially when they congregate and conspire and rub off each other. And we always want to think we're new, we're smart. Silicon Valley was the first, right? For a fact, San Francisco, right? What was it started by? It was started by people who would chuck everything and go across a continent or across the world to try to get gold, right? Hollywood. Hollywood was not built by blue bloods, firstborn sons, scions of rich family. It was typically built by immigrant Jews who changed their name after they got to Hollywood. But this was their chance at upward mobility. Pittsburgh, right? Massive creation of wealth. Even Montreal. The foundation of the city after the fort was the coureurs de bois, the guys who came here looking for furs and trade. So we live on a continent that's built by exiles, outcasts, dreamers, second sons, and chancers. It's like, again, the revisionist history, right? Oh, the founding fathers were all wise and smart and got along and always knew what they were building. Right? It was scary. It was dark. We didn't know where the hell we were going. And so when you were doing your own business and you realize, man, middle of the night, you got the cold sweats, that's okay. And when the VCs say, nah, we're not going to fund this one, you don't get it. That's okay. But you got to stick with it. There is a virtuous circle, and we've seen it in New York, and we've seen it in Seattle, where you get talent, ideas, and capital. A business grows. In the case of New York, a lot of it was DoubleClick. In the case of Seattle, a lot of it was Microsoft, and there's multiple examples in the Valley. But where you grow, you get commercial success, you have an exit. Either somebody buys you, you go public, then you got cash and smart people. And smart people, entrepreneurs, get bored in big companies. So what do? You say, okay, let's go start something else. And that's how it grows. It grows exponentially. But I want to talk for a minute about the flip side. How fast it can fade. These are companies that 20 years ago were, I'll say, major American, I assume Canadian brands. On a lot of street corners. Digital Equipment Corporation was the second largest computer company in the world in the mid-90s, only trailing IBM. And I can tell you for a fact they didn't hire any more suicidal people, drunks, and drug addicts than any other company. But they got together and made a whole bunch of decisions that fundamentally put them out of business. At the time, the decisions seemed perfectly rational. But they're gone right now. They're answering a trivia question, right? Digital got sold to Compaq, which got sold to HP. But all these companies were started by entrepreneurs. They had a good run, and they disappeared. So I haven't gone fist fighting with sharks lately, but about a month or so ago, I went on a 300-mile bike ride from Pittsburgh down to the outskirts of Washington, D.C. And so I basically did a long, slow ride through the Rust Belt. And along the way, first thought is, wow, 100 years ago, Pittsburgh was the Silicon Valley of the 19th and 20th century. Think about names like Rockefeller, Carnegie, Mellon, Morgan. The biggest source of wealth creation, job creation, innovation was Western Pennsylvania. And now you ride through it, and it's wreckage. And so the second thought I had was, well, if Pittsburgh was the Silicon Valley of the 20th century, why won't Silicon Valley be the Pittsburgh of the 21st century? Why aren't we going to follow in their footsteps? And so one of the thoughts, and I rode through some towns that were just ghost towns, boarded up windows, old rusted out wrecked cars, people hanging around because there are no jobs. So one thought is companies, cities, personally, you have no right to continued survival. We always think about our planning process as incremental, right? I've got what I've got, and I've got a right to grow 10 or 15% next year. Not necessarily so. So one of the things is you become a successful entrepreneur by being on the right side of history. And to some extent, I just encourage you to ignore people's input, right? Look, don't listen to those people that tell you you can't do it. You can do it. Well, what's going to happen down the road if you're successful is the market will start to change. People say, hey, the market's changing, and you'll ignore them too, right? Entrepreneurs are famous for flying the airplane up into the air and then flying it right back into the ground on the same thought. Always have a reason to exist now. Have a reason to exist going forward. It's like we have a lot of examples in the tech business of transitional life forms. And I'll say AOL, Yahoo maybe. They served a purpose, they made a lot of money, then their reason to exist went away, and now they're searching for a forward-looking reason to exist. Always think about if you had to start on white paper today, what would you do? Never assume that your customers love you. This is a blind spot, right? You say, oh, everybody thinks we're great. Everybody loves, it's like, because that's what you want to hear. Everybody rates us 7.5 on a 10-point scale or a 9-point scale. Well, guess what? About 10% of your customers love you, about 20% hate you, and everybody else, they don't care. They'll respond to the next Groupon, the next offer, the next new wave coming by. And so finally, respect competitors and substitutes. You created a business by disrupting somebody else. You have to ask yourself, who's going to disrupt us? Who's the one that I'm not taking seriously right now? Oops, let me go back one. Because what happens over time is the barbarians become bureaucrats. You say, oh, I'm lean, I'm hungry, I'm attacking, I'm stealing somebody else's food. Then you settle down and you get fat. You go, wow, this is pretty cool. I got private jets. I got marble and mahogany and carpets. Life is good. And you start thinking about your installed base. You start thinking, like I said, you just assume, you hire people. You hire people to think for you. But the one thing you can't ever get too far away from is what I call the reinvention imperative. Go back and continue to challenge, even as you're growing, continue to challenge all of your own assumptions. For me, I do this by continually getting into businesses where I've got to learn. I do it as a venture capitalist. I do it as an advisor, a board member. But it's constantly learning new businesses and trying to see how other people are thinking about the problems. Because if you only kind of reinforce your own thinking, you create blind spots. Talk to as many people as you can with completely different takes on the problem. And so with that, my 3 admonitions: stay ambitious, stay angry, and dream big dreams. Thank you very much.